Welcome to Life Unrestricted.
This is your show if you're sick of living a life controlled by food and exercise rules, and if you're ready to learn how to accept yourself and enjoy the heck out of life. My gig is about body image, femininity, self-worth, and resilience. Come on, let's walk side by side as we slowly step out of restriction misery and unlock our true selves.
Your host, Merritt Boxler, is a former national radio DJ, freelance journalist, speaker, and writer with a passion to make women feel good in their bodies. This is a show brought to you live from Switzerland.
Hello, lovely radicals. I hope you had a good week and that you're equally excited for today's episode as I am, because Chris Sandel, this lovely man that some of you might know from the podcast called Real Health Radio, was really great to talk to. And because it's been almost, I think, 3 months since we recorded this conversation, I'm so giddy to finally listen to it again today with you. And you're going to hear us talk about the Minnesota semi-starvation experiment, which will hopefully make a light bulb or two go off in some heads about the effects of caloric restriction on our body and our minds. Aside from that, we will also go into hypothalamic amenorrhea, the lack of menstruation due to over-exercising and under-fueling, be that conscious or unconscious, what real health really means, and how he helps his clients deal with weight gain in recovery. So lots of good stuff in this one. And lovely if you regularly listen to my podcast via my website, because you maybe found this podcast via a post that I posted on Facebook, then please do me a favor and also subscribe to Life Unrestricted on iTunes. Or if you don't have iTunes because you don't have an Apple phone, then, or on Stitcher, for example. That's one of the podcast apps for Android phones. There are quite a few upsides for this. First of all, you will get the episodes delivered directly to your phone, and you can listen to them anywhere, anytime, and you don't need an internet connection to do so. Great stuff. Second of all, you are then in a position to write me a rating and leave a review, which makes all the difference because iTunes, for example, works with pretty complicated algorithms that decide whether or not this show gets listed in their podcast list, of recommended shows, and is therefore visible for more or less people, and which shows just basically get drowned out by the sheer amount of podcasts out there. So your ratings and reviews aren't just good for my own ego, but much more so for people who are also in need of a more sane approach to the topic of eating, being healthy, and relearning to trust our own bodies again. Considering the amount of diet and weight loss shows out there. And thirdly, you will have the opportunity to download all the past episodes onto your phone too. And so everything will be right on your phone, which is totally convenient. So please do subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or whatever app you are using to listen to podcasts. And if you've ever wondered how it is possible that podcasts are free when clearly there goes a lot of work into them, here's how that works. Most podcasters either have a business attached to their show, like coaching or counseling or something along those lines, or they have an official media channel that they are a spin-off of. Or they have a ton of ads of, mattresses, meal services, supplements, or some website building businesses. You probably heard all of them, right? And then there's people like me who don't sell services, don't have a big media channel behind them, and those who just can't with those ads. I'm sorry, I find them unbearably annoying. So what do? We rely on loyal listeners who consider our cause worthy of support. And how do we get this support? Well, I choose a platform called Patreon, and I find it is a very trustworthy platform. Patreon is there for people with creative projects of all sorts that they are looking to find support for, and I really like them. And I'm very happy to announce that Krista, Jennifer, and Andrea have joined the ranks and therefore deserve a huge thank you for helping me to keep this work up and therefore also for helping other people to get this message. Because some people really don't have a few dollars to spare. And so it really is, I think, a solidarity thing. So if you can support this show, please do so for those who can't. So if you like what I'm doing, please consider becoming one of my loyal patrons. You can have a look at my page on Patreon. You can find it at patreon.com/lifeunrestricted. That's patreon.com/lifeunrestricted. And you can pledge any amount you find this show deserves per episode. And as I said, this week, Krista, Jennifer, and Andrea, thank you so much for being my heroes this week. And oh, by the way, before we get into today's conversation, something has been bugging me with iTunes. I don't know if you're an Apple user or not, but Apple has released a new software, and apparently they've also changed some podcast settings. And as of late, I see that most of my episodes don't show all of my show notes anymore, which really bums me out because I put quite a lot of work in writing pretty extensive show notes, to give people a good overview what the respective episode is about and what the topics are that my guests dive into. So as per now, I cannot change this. But what I can tell you is that as a Patreon of this show, you see every letter of my show notes, along with all the links to the books or articles or websites that were being talked about in the respective episode. So there's another perk to being one of the loyal supporters of Life Unrestricted. Plus, if you're a Patreon, you also get an email every week and early access when new episodes are released. But of course, for those who cannot afford to support me via patreon.com/lifeunrestricted, there's also the possibility to access the entire show notes via my website, because I always include the show notes in the post that accompanies the episode. And you can access that pretty easily by going to lifeunrestricted.org/LU and the number of the episode as it is in the title. So for example, for today's episode, that would be lifeunrestricted.org/LU063. I hope this wasn't too confusing, and I hope it helps. In today's episode of the Life Unrestricted podcast, as I said, we're going to hear Chris Sandel from outside of London, UK. Chris is a health and nutrition expert who runs his own company called 7 Health. And alongside that, his wonderful podcast, Real Health Radio, that I always listen to when he releases a new episode. Chris works with clients all over the world through private consultations, and he also creates and runs online training programs. Chris's approach to health and food is completely non-dogmatic, and he knows that there is no solution that is perfect for everybody, and that the more anxious and stressed out we are about food and weight, our health and our life will only suffer for it. Chris wants his clients to find their own personal best health, whatever that means for each individual, mentally, physically, and emotionally. He also has a specific interest in improving his clients' general relationships with food and body image issues. Chris and I had a time limit of a little over an hour before Chris had to hop on a call to a client, so we knew that we were probably not going to be able to cover all the things we wanted. And believe me, I had so many things I wanted to ask Chris about, but I can say that I'm really happy we could get into topics like I said, hypothalamic amenorrhea, when menstrual cycles go missing, and one of the most interesting studies when it comes to food, deprivation, calorie restriction, and the effect this has on our health and behavior. So we went into that. And if you're anything like me, when I first heard the details of this study, I had like a million light bulbs going off in my head, and I hope you have a similar effect when you hear it. Another thing we dove into was the way we as human beings can fall victim to making wrong judgments and assumptions. And we name some of those ways. And I will put some resources about human misjudgment and cognitive bias, as it's called, in the show notes. As I said, you can access them easily via my website, or if you're a Patreon, you get the extensive show notes anyway. And I highly recommend you look into some of the resources I put into the show notes, because there are so many ways in which we make false assumptions and don't even realize it. And if you find human behavior and social psychology as interesting as I do, you might love to have this list as a start to look into your own mind. It's very interesting. Anyway, now let's get into our conversation of today, and I'm really happy to finally be able to say, hi, Chris.
Hey, Merritt, how you doing?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm very well.
I'm really pleased to finally get a chance to talk to you. And I hope this will be an episode where I don't talk as much as I usually do. So to give my listeners a little break and let you do as much of the talking as you like, really, because I want to pick your brains. And you know that I've been a super happy listener of your podcast, Real Health Radio. And you have some stuff there, you know, your episodes on hypothalamic amenorrhea, the Minnesota starvation experiment, the difference between disordered eating and eating disorders, the adverse childhood experiences study. It's all there. Your podcast is amazing. And so I just thought, hey, let's bring Chris over and let him explain that stuff. And here you are. So before we start, I'd like you to introduce yourself a little bit and tell my listeners why you do the work that you do.
Okay, so my name is Chris Sandel. I am a nutritionist, and I say a nutritionist, but I do a lot more than that now. But I'm originally from Sydney. I moved to London, to the UK when I was 21. I finished a business degree and realized I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do. And within a short space of time of moving over here, I moved in with a couple, and one of the people in that couple was doing a detox. And she said, look, why don't you do this detox with me? At that time, I had really pretty terrible skin. I've always been someone who hasn't put on weight very easily. So I've always been very lean. And it meant that when I finished school, I just paid very little attention to what I would eat. Because at that stage, the only thing I ever thought about with eating was if you eat too much, you get fat. That was my very narrow view of things back then. But I could go and eat McDonald's, or I could eat kebabs, or I could eat what I wanted, and it never affected my weight. And so I would just eat that food. And it wasn't all that kind of food. I still lived at home. And so my parents still did a lot of the cooking, and we still ate reasonably well. But yeah, I went down that route a lot more, and it ended up with me having pretty terrible skin. And for about 2 or 3 years, I'd go on and off medication. So I'd be on antibiotics, and after 3-4 months, it would clear my skin up. I'd come off it. Within a couple of weeks, the bad skin would come back. And so I came over. I was in the UK, and yeah, someone said, why don't you would do a detox and see what happens as part of that. And so I did that for 4 weeks, and it had a real improvement for me. And I'm going to add a really big caveat here, which is I don't recommend detoxes with people.
Thank you.
And
I was sitting on calls here. I'm like, no, please.
No. And the thing I would say as part of that was it was pretty open-minded as a detox in comparison to the stuff that is on the market these days. So it wasn't a juice fast. It wasn't that restrictive. It was going on a largely vegetarian or even vegan diet. It was limiting sugar. It was limiting white flour. It was limiting certain things. But it was then encouraging to eat as much as you want. So you could have as much fruits and vegetables as you wanted. You could have as much beans and pulses as you wanted. You could have all of these different foods. And so it wasn't about restriction. It was more about changing the foods that you eat. And the thing that I really got out of it was it opened up my ability to cook. It opened up my eyes to all of these different foods that I wasn't used to eating. I was 21. I was able to cook a little bit, but I didn't have that much of a skill. And I was eating like a student. So having that opened up for me was a really good thing. And so afterwards, I would then oscillate between eating like a 21-year-old and then eating where I was, okay, let's try and look after myself a little bit more or have a little bit more of these types of foods and see what happens. And just noticing how foods would affect my sleep or my mood or my skin. And just found that I was reading more and more about it, bringing it up more in conversations, that kind of thing. And at some point decided, you know what, this is the thing that you've been looking for. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I'd found something that I was genuinely interested in. So I went and I studied at the College of Naturopathic Medicine in London, and it's a 3-year course and just looking at nutrition. And so I finished up that in 2008, and then in 2009 set up my own practice. And that has been something that's evolved over the years. I originally was unsure about what I wanted to work on with people, and a lot of what I've ended up working on with people is the kinds of people who just made their way into my practice, and then me starting to write about certain topics. So even though I'm a nutritionist, I work a lot with disordered eating and people on that spectrum. I do a lot of work with fertility. I do a lot of work with just the normal everyday run-of-the-mill, I don't have great digestion, or I'm having trouble sleeping, or the kinds of things people think of as coming and seeing a nutritionist about. But so much of what I do is focusing on lifestyle factors and people's beliefs and how they feel about their body and that kind of thing. So just really broadening it out as opposed to just follow this diet, you should eat these foods type thing, which is a lot of how people think of a nutritionist being.
Mm-hmm. And you are very knowledgeable when it comes to, women who miss their periods. And I have a lot of those in my listenership as well, or people who have dieted all their lives, or people with eating disorders or in recovery. So the detox you mentioned still bugs me a little bit, and I want you to go into it a little bit, because there are a lot of people for whom even just the word detox brings back very bad memories, or for people that it's just a very, very, very bad idea to cut out, the villains these days, sugar and wheat. And I'm not a proponent for that, because for me this meant a very dark rabbit hole. So I'd like to just have you clarify things a little bit.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, as I said, I don't recommend detoxes with people. And the people who normally want to do a detox are doing it because of they're wanting to lose weight, and they can talk about it from a health perspective or using it through the lens of I'm trying to be healthier, but it pretty much just comes down to I'm wanting to lose weight. And the majority of things that are on the market are very dangerous. You shouldn't be restricting your calories the way that is being suggested. You shouldn't be doing a juice fast for X amount of weeks. But also the psychology around it and the kinds of people who are buying into doing those kind of things and buying into what they think will be the end goal of that. So I came into this and did a detox. I had no issues around food at all, and I still have no issues around food. And I know I am in the minority of that stuff. I grew up very fortunately in a household where there was no dieting talk. I have a mother and I have a sister, and I can't remember at any point during my life where they have been on a diet or they've talked about dieting. There was no talk about body image. There was no talk about any of that stuff in their household. So I know that I came from a very privileged position, so that when I did it, and being in the body that I was already in, there wasn't any of the dieting talk. There wasn't any of the body image stuff. So yeah, that was why it worked for me in terms of broadening things. And this is the thing I think is really important. For me, doing that broadened what I was able to eat. It added things into my repertoire. For most people who go on a detox, it takes this whole list of things they're allowed to eat and then just reduces it down. And once the detox is over, they then continue on that reduced down list because they think it's quote unquote healthy. And so that's why I found it useful. But as I said, I always, if I'm talking about this, I add that caveat. And in my practice, I'm not recommending that people are doing this.
Mm-hmm. And you could reintroduce sugar and wheat after that program that you did or that eating thing.
Totally. And I did.
Yeah, sure. And as you said, I think it's for the people who, have gone down the rabbit hole that I did. It's just as you said, you nailed it. Like we start something and then we don't stop.
No.
Or we start it because we want to lose weight. And then when it stops and we gain the weight back, we blame ourselves and it's all about weight loss. And then, it starts to take very dark turns. But I see that for you, it was a completely different story and that deserves its place, of course. But thank you for clarifying. It's very important. Because I heard you once on your podcast also say that you were getting a lot of clients asking you about how to lose weight and they wanted you to help them lose weight. And what you said, and I never forgot that, was most of my clients didn't have any weight to lose. But interestingly, those are often the people who still want to lose weight. And I know that from myself, when I first started losing weight, it was never enough. Somehow it was, chasing that carrot. So is this still the case that people come and see you with a weight loss wish and you have to tell them, hey, you shouldn't be losing weight?
It's happening less and less. And I think the reason I'm saying that isn't because society at large is getting better. It's because the people who get in contact with me invariably have been following my work for a while, so they know what I'm about. And I'd say this has been great for me from a business perspective, but it's also great for the people who are getting in contact. Because before I start working with someone, and the way that I work with people is I work for a period of 5 months. We do an hour consult every 2 weeks. And that's to start with as a minimum. I don't start any other way because the way I want to work on this is through making habit changes by focusing on different things that are going on in terms of symptoms and markers within the body, and just having that time allows for that process to work properly. But before I sign anyone up as a client, I will have a free consult with them where I'll chat with them for 40 minutes, 50 minutes, an hour to find out, okay, what's going on? What do you want to be working on? What are you hoping to get out of us working together? And as part of that, when I have those conversations, people are always like, oh, I listen to your podcast or I follow you on your blog. And I discovered that I'm having a conversation with someone who's been hearing me talking already for 20, 30, 40 hours because they've listened to my podcast. And because of the content that I then put out, they kind of know that I'm not the weight loss guy. And so when they come to me and that's their goal, or at least one of their goals, I don't shut them down. I'm like, okay, cool, let's go through this and we'll talk through it. And I'm like, okay, what else is going on? And try and find out what is going on with all of their different symptoms. So how is their sleep? How is their menstrual cycle? All of those different things. So that when it comes time for me to respond in that conversation, I can say, cool, well, I can deal with all of these different things. I think you're having this going on because of this, etc. But when it comes to the weight, my response is always, I make no guarantees on that stuff. I don't know what's going to happen in terms of your weight. It might go up, it might go down, but what I can guarantee is I will be able to help you with your other symptoms. And then it's up to that person to decide what they want to do. But I'm pretty blunt with people, or blunt might not be the right word, but I'm very upfront with people when I'm having those conversations, because if I'm going to work with them for 5 months, I want them to know what it's going to be about and what I can really offer and what I can't really offer, etc.
So let's make up a patient. Let's call her Susie.
Okay.
Susie is coming to you and says, hey, hi, Chris. I don't know why I can't lose any more weight. I want to lose weight, but well, I don't really know what to do because I'm already exercising almost every day, and I think I have to burn more calories, but I don't even eat all that much, or sometimes I restrict during the day and then I binge at night and I don't sleep well, and I'm missing my period. Something's broken with my body. I feel awful, and somehow I can't seem to relax around food. Something is broken. What do you do?
Okay. So I would then be starting to ask even more questions around, okay, well, if you say you're not sleeping very well, tell me more about that. And if you say that you're having digestive issues, tell me more about that. So I want to have as much information as humanly possible.
Okay, let's get further with that. I would answer and say, I get up 7 times at night. I always have to pee. I don't know why. And you would ask about my digestive system, you said?
Yep.
So Susie would say, I don't know, I'm often bloated and I'm usually pretty constipated.
Okay. So as part of that, what I would start to focus on is say, I'm going to put the weight to the side for now. What I want to do is focus on all of the other symptoms that you have going on. Let's try and get you sleeping better. Let's try and get you to a stage where you can be eating regularly throughout the day so you have better energy. And just start to look at all of those different symptoms that they have going on. And normally the way I work is trying to focus on a couple of things at once, or even just one thing at once. So it's like, for the next 2 weeks, let's look at the sleep piece. And so let's look at, okay, why may that be happening? And for me, if someone's not sleeping very well, often it can be linking into them not eating consistently throughout the day, because to actually sleep properly, you need enough energy. And people have this misidea or misunderstanding that you're sleeping, you're lying on the back, nothing is happening, or you're lying on your side, but basically you're not doing anything. But while you're sleeping, your body's doing a huge amount of repair work. It's when your muscles are being rebuilt, when bones being rebuilt, when your immune system's at its highest. It's where your brain is consolidating all the learnings that you've had that day. So there's a lot going on. So what I would try to explain is like, okay, part of the reason you're not sleeping is for these different reasons. Let's focus on doing things to support that and see what starts to happen.
And when Susie says, well, I'm eating 3,000 calories at night and they told me I should intermittent fast. So for the past few years, I've only been eating dinner and I'm exercising. So it can't be that I don't have enough energy.
So the response to that would then be, it's not just about the energy that you're bringing in that one meal. It's about having energy come out throughout the day, because looking at what you're doing, it's obviously not working for you. So let's try something else to see if we can start to improve these things.
Mm-hmm. And would you connect the dots for Susie that her nightly peeing is also very much related to her not having a period, and that her not having a period is very much related to her underfueling and over-exercising?
Definitely. And that's so when I originally have the conversation with someone to start with and find out everything they've got going on, I will then relay that information back in terms of, okay, the reason I think this is going on is because of these two things, and then explain this part about physiology and why that could possibly be happening, so that they have this real 10,000 foot view about why all of these different things may be happening, how they can be connected, and why I think we should start to look at things in this other light or go in this direction to help improve that.
Can you explain some of those dots you would connect for Susie?
Okay, if you ask me about whichever dots you want me to explain, I can walk you through whichever ones of them.
Yeah, okay, so let's start with, because that has come up in the group as well. And for me, I know this well, this nightly peeing thing. I'm glad I brought this up someplace in my podcast and people came out and said they had the same thing. And interestingly enough, they were all also missing their period. And then I thought of you because you were the one that explained that in your podcast to me. So please explain the nightly peeing.
So the nightly peeing, and this can also be happening during the daytime if someone is peeing very frequently. And there can be a couple of different explanations, but I'll explain it from an energy perspective. For your cells to work well and to work as they should be, you need the right balance of water, of electrolytes, and also of glucose. And what typically starts to happen when someone isn't eating enough food, eating enough energy, is your cells have lower amounts of the electrolytes, lower amounts of the glucose, and high amounts of water. And so your body in this situation needs to try and bring things back into balance to get that ratio right. So it starts to push water out of the cells so that it can start to correct that. And so in those situations, you start to urinate, and you're urinating much more frequently. You have an urgency to go, and it's often much clearer urine because you're not using your urine in that sense to get rid of matter that's being detoxified or proteins or ammonia or other things. Your body's just trying to get fluids, water out of your system. And so this starts to happen at nighttime. People can either have frequent urination. Other people, in terms of trying to get that water out of them, can be starting to have night sweats, but it's often the body trying to do the same thing.
And what does it have to do with this antidiuretic hormone that is not being produced because there's not enough estrogen?
So with the estrogen part, I'm not sure on that at the moment while we're chatting, but in terms of antidiuretic hormone, you produce this in the evening time while you're sleeping or when things are working as they should be. You should be producing this in the evening while you're sleeping. You also produce other hormones so that you don't wake up in the night to have to pass a stool. But what happens is your stress response can override that production of antidiuretic hormone. And so when you run out of energy, you turn on stress hormones. So stress hormones have lots of roles in the body, but one of their roles is to bring energy to your cells so that they can run or they can fight. And so when you run out of energy when you're asleep, your body then turns on stress hormones, that shuts off the antidiuretic hormone, and you then wake up and need to urinate. So those two things go hand in hand in terms of you're running out of energy and your body's trying to get that water out of the cells, but that's also being either mediated or being turned on as well by that stress response.
So it is a sign of stress and that this person is probably not eating enough or exercising too much or generally stressed.
It can be all of those things, but in your example before where you said, okay, they don't eat anything during the day and then they eat 3,000 calories before going to bed, that 3,000 calories before going to bed, you're not able to turn all of that into energy. And so there might be then just a huge amount that's then sitting there that hasn't been turned into energy. So despite the fact that you've eaten a lot of calories, you would be better off having that come in throughout the day so that your body can then use that throughout the day as opposed to having a huge amount at night, because even though you've had that huge amount at night, you can then still wake up with that stress response because your body hasn't had a chance to convert that into energy properly yet.
All right. And how do you explain hypothalamic amenorrhea for people who don't know? This is the medical term for not having a period, for missing a period. Is better put, not for those who've never had one, but for those who the period went missing due to overexercise or underfueling. Can you explain to us how you would talk to a client about this?
So the way that I typically talk to clients about this is thinking about reproduction and its priority within the body. And in the whole scheme of things, if we're thinking about us evolving, growing up on the savannah, or that kind of very basics of human nature, we need to be able to survive. And when you think in that way, reproduction isn't that high up on the pecking order. Your body wants to know it's safe and secure. It wants to know that there's good amounts of food coming in. It wants to know it's in a relaxed environment, an environment that is then safe to bring a new child into the world, and not safe in terms of looking after and caring for that in some senses, but you're about to give off or use up somewhere in the vicinity of 50,000 calories to go from not pregnant to pregnant and delivering a baby. You're then using somewhere in the vicinity of 1,000 calories a day to nurse that baby. And so your body understands that math. And so it looks at, is it in our interests to be putting out hormones that could get us into this kind of calorie debt and having to use these kind of calories? If someone is living in a way that is nice and relaxing, they're eating very well, they're exercising at an appropriate amount for their body, they get proper sleep, downtime, their body's going to be more like, great, we can prioritize reproduction. We've got all of these other things going on. We know it's okay. But the more you are under eating, the more you are stressed, the more you're over exercising, that just gives feedback to your body, and your body doesn't understand your desire to look a certain way or about diet culture or what the thin ideal is or any of that. All it does is it looks at the feedback mechanisms that it's been given and makes the assumption it's not a safe time for us to be prioritizing reproduction. And so what it does is it makes changes so that certain hormones are produced less, and through those changes, you stop having a period. You stop ovulating. And so your body's like, yay, we've prevented you from getting pregnant. We've prevented you from getting into this huge calorie debt. And so from its perspective, it's trying to do a good thing. But obviously, as the individual, they're then losing their period.
And some people might say, not knowing the ramifications of hypothalamic amenorrhea, they might say, who cares? I'm not having a period. I don't care. I don't want to have a kid. So I'm okay. I want to look the way I do, so I don't mind. What would you tell them?
Okay, so first off, I would say everyone has the right to live their life however they want to, but I would also advise that your reproductive hormones and a woman's reproductive cycle is more than just about reproduction. Mm-hmm. So we talk about hormones and we normally clump them into categories where we say estrogen or progesterone is a reproductive hormone. But if you look at the functions that they have in their body-wide. So there are certain hormones like luteinizing hormone or follicle stimulating hormone where majority of what they do is just around reproduction. They are pretty narrow in their impact on the body. But things like progesterone or estrogen, even though they're also called a reproductive hormone, they do huge amounts of different things. So whether we're talking about bone health, whether we're talking about mental function, whether we're talking about like mood,
sleep,
to do with blood sugar regulation, sleep, like so many different things that are important to health outside of reproduction. So while on the surface, for some people, they may be thinking, great, I now don't have to deal with the monthly annoyance of getting my period, there are ramifications that come with that because you're then not getting the health promoting factors or benefits that you get from those hormones outside of reproduction.
Which one do you think is the worst consequence of not having a period? Or are there clients that don't know that and that look at you surprised and say, what do you mean, brittle bones?
I don't think there is any one problem that is worse than another. And the other thing I would also add to that is some people are affected in some ways and some people are affected in others. So some people may have HA and then they go and get their bone density checked and it's okay, but they suffer terribly with depression. And then someone else, like mood-wise, they haven't been so bad in the whole scheme of things or in comparison to others, but they go and check their bones and they're a disaster. And so it really can depend on that individual in terms of what symptoms are made worse and worse. But typically what you start to see is people are getting these clusters of different symptoms that are affecting all of their different systems because of the way those hormones work in a body-wide fashion.
Mm-hmm. We're both in several groups that deal with hypothalamic amenorrhea, and what I often come across is that how the moment when women or girls start to put two and two together and everybody's talking about their symptoms, and when there's new members in the group, then there's someone who says, I have to get up and pee every night, and my sleep is out of whack. My libido obviously is gone. My skin is dry. My hair is starting to thin out. I'm cold. My digestive system doesn't work properly. Either they have constipation or bloating, and all these things, apart from having weaker muscles and maybe brittle bones, when we can put those all together and say this is because our body is not functioning properly, and it's not just not having a period.
Yeah. And it's because as part of that stress response, but also as part of your body's priorities, it starts to prioritize short-term survival over long-term health. So much of the stuff that you just described there are nice to haves or about long-term function. So if you're on rations and your body's trying to spend very wisely, does it matter what your hair's really like? Like, does it matter that you're being able to digest your food very well? Like, in your body's way of looking at it, you are running from a line. It's not important to be able to digest your food right now. We've got other things going on. Same thing with your immune system. It's not important right now to create antibodies in the right way so that your health is supported. It's like we've got other things that are more important. So everything that you've just listed, like, definitely they start to affect people. And the one thing I would say with that is, so often when this is going on, people don't connect all their dots. They're just like, I don't have my period, but I've got all of these other things going on. They obviously can't be connected. And often when they go and speak to doctors, when they go and speak to other people, no one kind of puts two and two together and starts to understand, okay, how all these things are connected.
Yeah, no one told me either. I needed those groups. I needed Nicola's book, No Period, Now What, which I highly recommend. And I needed your podcast to finally hear someone talk about my own symptoms and going, what? This is connected. And now in those groups, I see it. So many women say that their doctors didn't help them. And even my doctor, I remember, like 10 times she must have suggested already that I should go back on birth control pill. And yeah, your words on that?
Well, it just doesn't solve anything. So having a pill bleed or having a bleed because you are on birth control says nothing about if your body can really do that on its own accord.
Doesn't
and
ovulate,
so often the suggestion is at the point at which you want to conceive, come back and then we can chat about it. But at that stage, when you then come back to chat about it, there's not a huge amount of solutions apart from, okay, cool, let's now go down the IVF route, or let's now go down kind of giving you more drugs. There's no real look at, okay, why might this be happening? And I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that so much of the suggestions around how to beat HA and how to get your period back fly in the face of what people think should be health advice. So to say to someone, actually, you shouldn't be doing exercise, you need to have some time off, that seems crazy for a doctor to tell someone that. To be saying to someone, actually, you need to be eating more food, you need to be having more carbohydrates, like it just is so the antithesis is what the general everyday advice is, that I think that's part of the problem. Like it takes a huge paradigm shift to really start to get your head around it.
Yeah, it seems like even the medical field is so indoctrinated in this, anything for getting people to lose weight or watch their weight. And when in fact the cure is getting more body fat, this sounds, as you said, flies in the face. But even when I showed my doctor the whole book, Nicola's book, and she doesn't seem to really hear it.
Yeah.
I don't know why. So how do your clients react when you basically tell them probably their innermost dream, but the one thing that they are deathly afraid of almost is like rest and eat more? So they probably look at you in a puzzled way like, what do you mean?
Yeah, I think that happens less now because, again, I've talked about these things on podcasts. But when it does happen, I'm explaining it like I have here and making that connection and telling them why these things are going on. I, too, recommend Nicola Rinaldi's book a lot. I think it's really well researched, really well done. But I would also add, part of the reason I work with people for such a long time is this has to be a gradual process, and not because someone can't just go all in on day one. If they want to, they can, but you're starting to undo a lifetime of thinking about someone's body, of thinking about eating, of thinking about dieting, and that just takes time. So it's not I don't expect to have a conversation with someone for half an hour and I've convinced them. Like, that's just not going to happen 99% of the time. It's about, okay, starting to chat about these things. And again, why my podcast has been so helpful is that when people arrive, there's already been that convincing going on or that talk going on for a long time because they've been listening for so long.
Yeah, exactly. And that's probably a good moment to also tell Susie or our listeners about the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, because if they are as courageous as they might be and follow your advice and eat more and exercise less, they might experience hunger attacks and extreme hunger, and they call them binges. And they don't understand this, and this makes them maybe want to restrict again because it makes them freak out. So it would be a good moment to introduce the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, if you could explain what it is and what it showed.
Yeah, sure. So this was something that when I found it and started reading about it maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I was just fascinated by it, and I really dove into it. So it was an experiment that was done back between 1944, 1945. So end of Second World War, there was chance that could be mass starvation all around the world. And so they wanted to look into, okay, how do we deal with this? What foods could be supportive of it? And so they enlisted 36 men who were conscientious objectors. So they didn't want to fight in the war, but they were happy to participate as part of the study. In the end, they only used 32 of the men's results, and I can explain part of the reason why that is. So the study started with
mentally and physically very, very healthy men.
Definitely. There was like 300 or 400 people who applied, and they picked like the best of the best, and they screened them in terms of physical health, but also mental stability, all of this. So they were trying to pick the best subjects who were the healthiest, who had no issues around food or dieting at all. And I mean, we're going back to the 1944, 1945. Dieting wasn't what it is today, and it definitely wasn't what it is today for men. And so these were a lot of men who were quite fit. They worked a lot on the land. I think a lot of them were. I mean, back then everyone, or a lot bigger percentage of the population was working outdoors. So you're talking very healthy, fit people. And so they started them for a 12-week period of just a control period, where they just wanted them to eat, and they wanted them to be weight steady as part of that. And they're actually eating around 3,200 calories. So when people talk about 1,200 calorie a day diets and all of this kind of thing, these guys were eating 3,200 calories and they were weight steady as part of that. So then there was a 26-week period where they were put on a starvation diet, and it was actually called a semi-starvation diet, and they were reduced to 1,560 calories. So again, people talk about going on a 1,200 calorie a day diet. These guys were put on something for 1,560.
And calling it a semi-starvation, yeah.
And calling it semi-starvation. So for 26 weeks, they were on this. And then at the end of this, and I'll go back through what happened as part of it, but I just want to talk about how they set up the study. Mm-hmm. After the end of those 26 weeks, they then had a 12-week control period. And what they want to do as part of that control period was try out different diets, different percentages of proteins and and carbs, etc., because they were wanting to work out what would be the best things to be feeding people in starvation situations if there was this mass starvation around the world. And then there was a final 8-week rehabilitation period where there was no restriction on their calories and they could eat what they want. So let's go back to the 26-week period where they're on 1,500 calories, 1,560 calories. Over that period, the men lost approximately 25% of their body weight. It averaged out, I think it was about like 16.5 kilos, 37 pounds, somewhere in that ballpark. Some people lost a bit more, some people lost a bit less. But not only did they lose all of that weight, there was a huge amount of symptoms that started to come up. And I've got quite a list of this stuff, so I'm happy to go through all the different symptoms they started to go through. And what I would say is, think of the stuff that Merritt was mentioning before that happened with people who suffer with HA. So as part of it, their basal metabolic rate dropped, and it dropped by about 50%. Their pulse dropped, and they were averaging around 30 to 40 beats per minute at rest. Real sensitivity to cold. Like, these men were wearing really heavy clothes, lots of layers, constantly wanting hot baths, wanting hot drinks, freezing cold hands and feet. Their tolerance for heat then increased. So they could hold really hot plates. They could eat exceptionally hot food. They had no desire for physical exercise. So as much as the study went on, they just wanted to do less and less. And they wanted to just lie down and lie in the sun and try and keep warm. Their tea and coffee consumption increased to the point where they actually had to cap it at 9 cups a day because the guys were just starting to have so much of it.
Yeah, and women do that as well. We drink coffee to suppress the hunger, or smoke and drink coffee.
Correct.
Oh.
They started drinking loads of water to try and fill themselves up. They started chewing huge amounts of gum. They were having there was someone who was having, I think, 40 packs of gum a day until they had to set a maximum of 2 packs of gum a day. Huge amounts of irritability, completely lost interest in sex. And they actually looked at their sperm count, and it just went through the floor. Lower amounts of red blood cells, lower amounts of white blood cells. So white blood cells are your immune system. Their hair started to fall out and grow slowly. They had the same with their nails, and decided they started to get lots of mental illness issues. So I said earlier that some of the people didn't make it for the final part of the study results. So they started with 36, they ended with 32. So one of the guys accidentally, and I'm using accidentally in quotation marks, cut off his finger with a chopping axe. And even now when they talk to him, he says, I can't tell you whether I did it intentionally or not. So he was in a completely delirious state. They became completely obsessed with food. So it would become their topic of conversation. They'd start reading cookbooks. They were applying to go to agricultural school. They dreamed of being chefs. If they were watching a movie, that would be the bit of the movie that they would all be so interested in. They became very protective of their food. And so they'd be eating and not wanting to talk with anyone about it. They were cutting these things up into weird portions and having very ritualistic behaviors around their eating. They'd start licking their plates. I mean, all of this stuff just started to happen from these guys who had no issues with food whatsoever to now it happening simply because they were restricting what they're eating. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, I mean, digestion-wise, they became very constipated, so they were going once or twice a week. They were getting muscle cramps and muscle pain. Their skin became rough and thin, just lost all ambition. So that
they started to steal food somewhere, 1 or 2?
There was a guy, so there was a guy one of the people who was cut out of the study went and stole food, because what they would do is they were all kind of kept in this one area, and they'd have their meals together, and they'd only be able to eat what was provided for them. But there was one day that there was a day trip out. I think they went to the movies, or I think they did something, and this guy kind of just got free and went into one shop and started eating, and just went into shop after shop after shop and just kind of binged his way through every milk shop and milk bar and burger place all the way back. And then they, I think, eventually removed him from the study because they realized the state that he was in.
And this is so important to know, that, deprivation really does cause binges. And so that no one should feel like it's a lack of willpower or that they're somehow broken, but this is a body's normal reaction. And I find this is an interesting detail.
Yeah. And so, I mean, your body just biologically is trying to, as I was saying before, it's trying to keep you alive. It's trying to do the best it can because it realizes what is going on. And so, as I said, over that time, they lost a huge amount of weight. And then once the study was over, so they then had this 8-week period where they could eat whatever they wanted. And when that happened, the floodgates just opened. So the first week, they were averaging 4,400 calories a day, but certain people were getting up to 10,000 calories a day. And even though they're all eating this amount of food, all of them were complaining that they just were still hungry. So even though their stomachs were so distended they couldn't fit any more food in, they were still hungry. And what happened pretty quickly within a matter of weeks is some of the things that were a problem started to improve. So their basal metabolic rate started to come up. They started to notice improvements in some of their stools. Like all of this started to change, but it was a really long period before it got better. And in the beginning, they started obviously putting on a lot of weight. And this is disproportionately towards fat storage. And they put on a lot of weight around their midsection. And so at some point when they are at the weight at which they originally started the study, they had a much higher percentage of fat versus lean tissue, because that's what the body is trying to just preferentially store around your organs in the beginning. And then as time goes on, then they start to repair the organs, then they start to repair the lean tissue, etc. But it wasn't until, I think it was something like 46 weeks after the study was over, that the guys got back to where they had pretty much started. And they got back to that not by dieting, not by doing a huge amount of exercise, just by simply giving their body what it needed and by eating to satiety. And at some point, I think it was around about the 30-week mark, despite the fact that they were eating huge amounts of food, they hit this weight plateau. And despite the fact that they continued to eat to satiety, the weight just started to come back down naturally. And so they ended up being in a similar place to where they started the experiment. Some were a little higher, some were a little lower, but roughly where they started.
And this is also very important for people to know, because it implies the often very much feared overshoot in recovery when people, start gaining more in order for their bodies to trust them again and to get them in the safe zone. Yeah. And also that this fear of I will never stop gaining weight, that this is not actually true. So how do you, talk your clients off the ledge when they start freaking out?
I guess part of it is referencing this study and showing what has happened. I also start to talk about, well, let's look into your weight biases. Why is there these fears going on? What is it about gaining weight that's so problematic for you? I also spin it around and I say, when you were dieting, did you ever have this fear that you would just continue to lose more and more weight so that you then just faded away and disappeared? And they're like, well, no, I didn't. I was like, okay, that's interesting. Why is that? And so start to explore some of those kind of ideas, because most of the time the fear of the increased weight is wrapped up in weight bias and what it means to be fat and all of that type of thing more than anything else.
And how do you dismantle that? What is it that usually comes up?
I mean, the answer to that is there isn't really one thing. And what normally happens is it's me getting people to do different journaling or different writing exercises, or you should watch this documentary or you should read this book. And it's just by going through that kind of a process of making little changes that start to chip away at someone's beliefs or someone's biases about, okay, why do you believe this?
What is a typical bias, a weight bias? Like, but I can't be healthy if I gain weight, or my partner will leave me if I gain weight, or what do you come across?
So yeah, like both of those would be two of them. What are people gonna think of me when I'm heavier? I could never be happier if I'm at that weight. And what I find quite interesting with this stuff is there can be this level of cognitive dissonance with it, because I can talk about someone else and they're like, oh, that's fine. Like, yeah, I can see they're happy and they're heavier, but I couldn't do it for me. And it's like, okay, why is that the case? And starting to explore that. But it's really difficult for me to give you this is the one trick that just changes everything, because the reality of it is there isn't that one thing. No. And there's been clients that I'll chat with this stuff about, and like consult 2, they just get it and it's fine and they just get through this stuff and it just doesn't affect them. And there's other people where it's a much more arduous struggle for them and it takes a lot longer. And so, and it can be a throwaway comment that I make that really hits home, or it could be something that they read or whatever. So there isn't one thing. And so over the years, I've just got this folder and artillery of just more and more things that I send to people, and just explore it from lots of different angles. As I say, just to challenge their beliefs about weight, about health, about all of that stuff.
Yeah, I just wanted to, pick your brains whether there are typical myths that come up that are so entrenched in our brains, in our psyche, because we've been exposed to all those messages for so long.
I think that probably one of the big myths, or the big feeling that people have, is that I'm just going through this, like everyone else has got it figured out and everyone else has got it so much easier, but I struggle. And so it's talking about, well, no, lots of people really struggle with this. And because it can be very easy to compare yourself to others and compare yourself to something that's not even true. So I think probably looking at that, I think one of the other ones is survivorship bias. So with a lot of the stuff that comes out online is, I did this detox, or I did this diet, and 6 weeks later, look at my body. And that may have actually happened for that person. I'm not going to dispute that, but there's probably another 1,000, 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 people who tried that thing and didn't get anywhere near the results.
Yeah, it's
or
like
the results were a disaster.
Yeah, someone is jumping out of an airplane and the parachute doesn't open up correctly, but by some twist of fate, they survive, and then they go on to say, you don't really need a parachute.
Correct.
And then everybody believes it. So that's a lot of what's going on, even, on YouTube and Instagram. People, they don't even know whether or not it's causal that something worked, but they go on to promote it as if it were the cure. And thousands of people go, oh, I just got to eat only this, or just got to not eat sugar ever again, or whatever it is. And we believe everyone. And, with the halo effect, if it is someone that we already know, maybe an actress or an actor or someone we even just like, then whatever they say, they are probably right about it, right?
Totally. Yeah, I think the halo effect, that study, that Edward Thorndike was the guy who coined that phrase and did the study. Really important to keep in mind. If someone has characteristics that you like from a physical perspective, you will make assumptions about them in a positive light in other areas. So if you think someone is attractive, you'll think that they have a better relationship, a better job, a better house, etc. And so much of the people who are successful in health or nutrition or whatever it may be isn't because of what they know or their ability. It's because of their attractiveness. And people buy into the fact that, oh, they look attractive. If I just do what they do, then I will have that too. And that is just not true.
Yeah, I'm currently reading on, the cognitive mistakes that we make, thinking that we are completely thinking right, but we don't really think about our thinking and what gets us tripped up. And I'm reading several books on this topic, and it's crazy interesting. And it's so uncomfortable to, every other page, the author describes something and I'm like, oops, I do that too. Heck, I don't like to hear that. But it definitely happens, and the negativity bias is one of my favorites. Like, if I were your client and you'd say, okay, just rest and eat, and no, you will not gain forever, and yes, your symptoms are connected, and I would just go on and say, the worst is going to happen, and I can cite 1,000 examples, but this cannot be healthy, and this, but this, and, just thinking about the worst things and not even thinking that maybe restoring my health will put me in a completely different mental state where I would argue completely differently a year from now.
Totally. And I think there's a couple of podcasts that I listen to. There's one called Hidden Brain, and then there's another one called You Are Not So Smart, which looks at all of the different biases that we have.
I have the book on my bedside table. You're not so smart.
Yeah, which I think is good. There's another, just as you're talking about this, there was a really fascinating study that was done in Israel with judges. And the point of this study that I want to point out is that we don't have the kind of free will that we think we do.
Yes.
I'm getting to the point where I think free will is largely an illusion, and we are very much impacted on by environmental factors. But as part of the study, they looked at, it was 8 Israeli judges and their rulings on parole hearings, so whether someone should be paroled or whether they shouldn't be paroled. And it was 1,000 rulings. I can't remember the year that they looked at. But what they looked at was how would time of day impact on whether someone was paroled or not. And what they found is first thing in the morning, 65% would get parole. As the day went on, it would go down to about 0 just before lunch. After lunch or after they had a snack, it'd go back up to 65% and then come back down.
They were hungry.
So these are people who should be completely objective. They should be looking at the case based on its merits. And instead, what was happening was wherever they were with their blood sugar would dictate how they saw the world. And I think that's really important to remember in terms of free will, but also when people are thinking about the negativity bias, or with people with HA, you being underfed really clouds how you view the world.
Oh, yeah, that's true. And there's that I want to address. Like, if people get better, do they still hold on to their old beliefs? Like, yes, but now I want to lose weight or whatever it is. Or do you really see that when they improve, that their whole attitude changes and they basically look back and say, "Woof, what was I even saying then?"
I think some of it is physiology driven, i.e. when you get more food, you just start to see the world in a different light. But I don't think that accounts for everything. And so when I'm working with clients on this kind of stuff, a lot of the focus in the early part is to get more food coming in, just because if there's not that food coming in, it's really difficult to start to be rational and to start to think about these things. So that has to be the starting place, but just getting someone to eat more, it doesn't resolve everything. So in the Minnesota starvation experiment, it kind of did, because these guys went into this without any problems, and they weren't living in the culture that was fixated on thinness and all of this. So they were kind of like a clean slate. But for most people, they're getting to the point of restricting after hating on their body for years and decades and all of this internal dialogue, etc. So that's a different situation. So I think, yes, working on the food side and helping it from a physiological perspective can change it. But I also think there's other work that needs to be done.
Oh, yeah, completely. And I wanted to just ask you first of all, I just want to say something that people with HA, hypothalamic amenorrhea, are often not at a very, very low weight. So for those people who think, well, I'm not that thin, it's important also to just include that. There are so many people suffering from restrictive eating at higher weights, and suffering from not having periods at high weights, and having eating disorders at all different sizes. And we really cannot judge. So for anyone who might have thought, well, that's not for me,
And this comes back to the survival stuff I was talking about before, because you can be at a much higher weight, drop some weight as part of that, your body can still be like, okay, we're about to enter into a famine here. We need to prioritize certain things and not prioritize others. So yes, I think someone's body fat, once it gets below a certain level, can make it more likely, but it's definitely not the deciding factor. And you've got all of these other things that can impact on it, like psychological stresses. So you can have someone who is incredibly stressed regardless of where their body weight sits, and the body decides to not prioritize reproduction. There's a really great book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers by a guy called Robert Sapolsky, and he talks about amenorrhea with women in concentration camps. So in the Nazi concentration camps. And what they found was that something like 50%, 60%, somewhere in that vicinity, lost their period within the first month. And so this is before the slave labor, the restrictions and all of that had kicked in to put their body in a physiological state where fat reserves were so low, etc. So just that psychological terror of being in that situation, and I don't mean just that psychological terror. I understand how horrible that would be, but I mean the mental side of things has a really big impact on what your body chooses to prioritize. So if there's a huge amount of fear around food, around life, around self-esteem, around all of these different things, that in of itself can start to shut these processes down.
Yeah, living in fear of food can severely limit our life, or living in fear of eating or not eating and not exercising. It's terrible. Do you have a gut feeling at what point you need to bring in the adverse childhood experience study with your clients, when you realize that maybe they're stuck somewhere and that there's a deeper pain going on?
So this is something that I've discovered more recently and looked into in detail more recently. And what I am doing now is I'm bringing this up with all clients. And so the Adverse Childhood Experience Study was a study that was done back in 1985. I think that was when it kicked off. And it started out at a weight loss center run by Kaiser Permanente. And as part of the weight loss, it was dealing with people who were 100 to 600 pounds overweight. That was how they described it. And what they found was when they were going through this weight loss treatment, that about 50% of them were dropping out, which doesn't seem that surprising the way that most people talk about dieting and the high failure rate, etc. But the people who were dropping out weren't dropping out because their weight was plateauing. They were dropping out despite the fact that they were consistently losing weight. And so they started to look into, okay, why may this be going on? And as part of that, by interviewing these people, they discovered that there was sexual trauma that had gone on, and there had been incest that had gone on. And they started looking into more and more and started to realize how many of these taboo type subjects that no one talks about actually happens. And so they then decided that they wanted to roll this out and see, okay, it's probably not just having an impact on weight. Let's see what happens in other areas. So they enrolled as about 1,900 cohorts as part of the study. It was done with Kaiser Permanente's members who are members of that insurance company or health club. I can't remember exactly what they were, but they would ask them about a list of different adverse childhood experiences. So moving out just from sexual experiences to then looking at things like other forms of abuse, so physical abuse, mental abuse. They looked at if there'd been drug and alcohol in the household when they were growing up, if there'd been violence towards the mother or towards other people in the household. So they came out with like 10 different areas. And then they also looked at how it affects different symptoms and different medical outcomes. So whether we're talking about diabetes or heart disease, but also how likely someone was to become a drug addict themselves or to overconsume alcohol or to be more promiscuous, etc.
And anxious and depressed, Yeah,
and what they then discovered as part of this is pretty much the more ACEs you have in childhood, the more likely you are to then suffer with these diseases. And the thing I would say with this is no one is a statistic. This is what happens across the board. So there are people who could have 0 ACEs who have terrible health and they're plagued with anxiety and they have lots of problems mentally and physically, etc. You could have someone who has a very high ACE score who actually is in great health and they've been able to get away with it. But what they're looking at is on the average, the more ACEs you have, the more likely you are to have problems from a health perspective, but also more likely to use drugs or alcohol or other ways of coping.
Yeah, in simpler terms, like the more trauma or the more prolonged your trauma was, the more likely it is that you have certain ways of self-medicating. Be
Correct.
that not eating, be that overeating, be that overexercising, anything we do to numb out emotions, and that can be, up to drug use and gambling addiction, sex addiction. So it just goes to explain that we really are deeply, deeply impacted by early memories, and the more that piles on, then the more likely it is that the only way we know how to deal with it is to self-medicate. And that's why some people find it so hard also to recover, because then they have to process all that pain. That's what's going on with me right now. And, it's so much easier to just restrict and over-exercising, instead of dealing with what was wrong. But the path to liberation is working through that. And before I ask you my final question, because I know you have to run, I want to ask you about your latest project, Tummy.
So Tummy is something I've been working on for the last 2 years, 18 months, something like that. So a lot of how I work with clients is getting them to use a food log. And I say that with a caveat.
I don't
always do it in that way. And also, a food log from my perspective isn't just about let's look at your calories, let's look at your macros, let's look at things so that you eat less. It's paying attention to what time are you eating, what are you eating, what time are you going to bed, what's going on with all of your different symptoms, and starting to make connections between how you feel and what symptoms you get, etc. So it's, for me, something that is an awareness tool, helping someone to learn more about food and their body, etc., as opposed to pretty much everything else on the market that is a food log app, which is about tell us how much weight you want to lose and we'll tell you how many calories you should be eating.
Yeah, and macros and calories. So for your Tommy is more about, being an anthropologist about what is actually going on.
Yes, I've never described it in that way, but I will be stealing that from you. Yes,
Great.
It is about getting people to be understanding about their different symptoms, because what I often find is that we get to a stage where someone's health isn't completely perfect, and I think that's a mirage. Like, no one's health is perfect, and there'll be times where you don't sleep so well, or you're having issues with digestion, or whatever it may be. But previously, someone would be like, I have no idea why this is going on. But you then get to a stage where you're like, I know why this is going on. I've been doing these couple of things. And maybe I can't stop doing those things at the moment because I've got this project I need to figure out or finish off at work, etc. But just getting people to understand more about their body and doing it in a way that it doesn't become like overanalyzing and hyperanalyzing everything that they're doing, but just starting to be more in tune.
Yeah, very interesting. And if people want to work with you, which I, of course, would recommend to everybody, how do they find you? Or even, your wonderful blog and your amazing podcast, and where is all that?
Okay, so my website is Seven, so the word spelt out, SEVEN-health.com. I have a podcast called Real Health Radio. If you just search for it in iTunes, it will come up. And then I have a Facebook page, which is the number 7 health. And I have an Instagram page, but I'm pretty lackluster in adding stuff to it. It's normally I'm on holiday and I'll put up a couple of snaps, but that's kind of it. But yeah, I put out a huge amount of content through my podcast, and then through my website. I have a blog there. So if you just go to 7-health.com, you'll be able to find that there. And if people are interested in working with me, there's a thing on my site that's something, I can't remember what the tab is, but it's something fairly obvious like work with me.
Yeah. Let me just acknowledge all you do is wonderful, and it's been so helpful, and I'm so glad you're out there. And I don't even know what I would do. There's so much stuff that I've learned, like in my sickest days when I discovered your podcast along with Summer Inninens. That really opened up a whole new world for me, and I'm really thankful for that, and that needed to be said. What would you like to be remembered for, Chris?
Wow, that has really put me on the spot. I I guess just being able to help people and being compassionate. And as I said at the beginning, I'm very aware, almost hyper aware of how lucky I am to have had the privilege to have grown up in the household that I have. And so I want to give back as much as I can around that stuff, because I know I've had an easier start than most. And so, yeah, that's probably how I would like to be remembered.
Yeah, and I thank you for, helping people become less obsessed with healthy eating and less obsessed with weight and start to live their lives again. And with your help, I'm sure they can do that. So thank you for this amazing conversation, Chris.
Well, thank you for having me on the show. I really, really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
I genuinely really enjoyed doing that.
Thank you.
And I don't always lead podcasts feeling like that. The more
Really?
I do this, the more I realize that there is an art to being an interviewer. With you, it's nice. It feels we're genuinely having a conversation, and that's not always the case. It can feel very much running through a list of questions. There's not much back and forth. But no, that was really enjoyable. So if you ever need or want me to come on again, I would be more than happy to.
Thank you. I won't forget that. Okay. Have a good evening, Chris.
Perfect. All right, Merritt.
This was today's dose of badassery from Life Unrestricted. Find the show notes with links to everything we mentioned in this episode over at lifeunrestricted.org. And if this show is making you feel good, awesome. Make sure to subscribe and please let others feel good too. By leaving a 5-star review on iTunes, you'll help make this show more visible and therefore more accessible for others. You're the best. Thanks.